I'm Joe Conkright in for Nick Lawrence on Curtains at 8, 91.3 WUKY. Now we shift gears just a little bit from colonial history to some local history. We're back with Mac McCormick of University Press of Kentucky. Mac, welcome back to Curtains at 8. How you doing?
Glad to be here as always. Doing well. Yourself?
You brought a guest in, another author who's just passing through at this point.
I did. A chance to bring in an author from out of town, though writing on a topic of interest here in not just Kentucky, but Lexington. James P. Cousins is here with us talking about his new biography, Horace Holley, Transylvania University and the Making of a Liberal Education in the Early American Republic.
James, welcome back to Central Kentucky. I know you spent some time here. You got your Ph.D.
I did. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and you also spent a little bit of time at Transylvania as well.
I did, in the archives. That was the subject of my dissertation. I looked at Transylvania and the creation of Transy and Presbyterian controversies in the early part of Transy's history. Everything really leading up to 1818 and Horace Holley.
Yeah, what fascinated you about Horace Holley?
Well, so much, really. Every time you look at Kentucky in a narrative source, it'll, when it briefly touches on Kentucky, you'll find passages relating to Transylvania University and then invariably to Horace Holley, and then it'll just sort of disappear and go on. And so it was really the high watermark of intellectualism here in Kentucky, and Horace is credited with so much of that, not just the rise of the university, but also with medicine, with law, and with the creation of really an intellectual status here in the city.
Where did he come from, and what kind of a person was he?
Horace came from, he was born in a town in Salisbury, Connecticut, northwest Connecticut, and went to Williams College, educated there as a boy, and then ended up at Yale, where he finished his, I guess you would call it an undergraduate degree now. Apprenticed for the law for a little bit, and then came back and studied for divinity. Horace thought that would be a good, proper vocation for him. And then started out his ministerial career in Boston after some time at another church, and converted to Unitarianism from Presbyterianism. And that was a hard break for Horace, but it was a good one. He became known for his his popular speaking style. He was well known throughout Massachusetts, and particularly with the new moneyed class of Boston, and bringing in a new fresh audience. And he packed one church, and they tore it down, built another one to deal with the expanding congregation. And somehow his name came across the trustees of Transylvania University. There's some connection there with James Prentice, who was a early trustee. But how and why they chose Horace, they had a couple options, but they went with Horace eventually. And this is 1815. They gave him a first offer, and then they rescinded it, and then on into 1817, they gave him another offer. And this is 1817, so you get a knock at your door, and someone says, "Guess what? You've been nominated president of Transylvania University." And he says, "Well, where is it?" And then makes a tour, and by way of other colleges, because Horace is a minister at that point and doesn't really understand what a university is and what's expected of him. So he, takes his time. He's been to college, but he doesn't really know how to build a college, and certainly not how to build be a president. So he visits Columbia and Penn and University of Pennsylvania Medical School and some other places. And what he decides and what he realizes is that higher education really is all about medicine. And that's where you get the really, that's the importance, the éclat is what he called it, of education was in medicine. So that's really where he directed his early interests. And he brings out Charles Caldwell and some other important figures, and decides to put most of his efforts there. And that's really where Transylvania takes off. Their medical class just soars, and Transylvania reaches high.
You said he was offered originally, and then it was rescinded. Why was it rescinded?
Well, there was just some confusion in the board of trustees as to the legitimacy of his appointment. They were divided, and this was a really kind of transition point in Transy's history, as sort of divided among kind of feuding members of the trustees, and the state. In 1817, finally says no more, and they abolish the board and just staff it with known quantities. So they give Henry Clay the leadership of it and bring in some other people just to kind of quell the dissent. And they just start with a fresh slate.
So was it more common to have academics appointed presidents? I mean, he's coming sort of outside of that world.
Great question. Absolutely not. It was more common to have ministers. And I think for that reason, Horace being a Unitarian and therefore rather liberal in his theological convictions was seen to be an appropriate person, maybe a uniter, rather than someone who would play a part in one of these factions. He was also a pretty tremendous orator and attractive there, in that way. And young, he was a young man. He was 38 when he became president of Transylvania University. So he was, that energetic, youthful spirit, I'm sure, attracted some attention to him.
How much how much did Henry Clay play in this decision to bring him in here?
I think a good amount. I think more than anything, and the correspondence between Horace and Henry Clay really speaks to this. He was just really tired of the dissent and just wanted things settled and wanted a university here in Lexington that would just go on and be that kind of beacon of light that he had hoped it would be. He was affiliated with the university for years and years, but always kind of frustrated in his efforts to build it up because of internal dissensions. And so really, I think he saw this as a real opportunity for the city more than anything, and understood that bringing in someone who could lead the university and generate more enrollment would mean more students, more businesses.
James P. Cousins is our guest. He is the author of a new book about Horace Holley, president of Transylvania University. We have Mac McCormick from University Press of Kentucky, which has just published the book. And Mac, I want to invite you into the conversation. Do you have some questions?
Well, I was always curious about the relationship between Henry Clay and Horace Holley and how it deteriorated over the years of his presidency.
Yeah, it takes a hit as time goes on, and a lot of that has to do with just, I think, Horace's frustrations with the political situation. Horace and Henry are sort of joined at the hip. They're both in that same political mindset. Horace grows up as a Federalist and is an avowed Federalist, which means that he believes that education really is reserved for elites. And this works against this really strong populist strain that's hitting the state in the early 1820s. Of course, Henry Clay takes a hit alongside, and then their relationship begins to fracture. So much so by the end of Horace's time at Transy, Henry loses faith in his ability to lead, I think, appropriately. And his son, Henry Clay Jr., wants to join Horace on this European expedition. And Horace is he's moving into the next phase in his career, and he says, things aren't working out well in Lexington. I'm going to take a body of students with me to Europe on this traveling academy is what he called it. And so they travel to the great courts and parliaments of Europe and visit astonishing sights and things. And Henry Clay Jr. writes his father, and he says, well, can I join President Holley? And Henry Clay says, absolutely not. I would not trust you in his hands. I don't think he could carry anything to fruition at this point. It's just better left. And I think that speaks volumes as to their relationship.
The idea that Lexington, it was the Athens of the West. Now, this is something I've always heard growing up here,
sure.
And I don't know if I've ever quite understood what that meant. What they were trying to achieve out of that, to become the Athens of the West. What does that mean?
Yeah, and that's a moniker that's really assigned to Lexington by city fathers as much as anything else, and in its earlier history. So, and Transylvania really rises to prominence first in the 1790s, and its first real president, Harry Toolman, brings the university into kind of national repute. The origins of the Athens of the West, I don't think anyone really knows. It just kind of takes off at some point. But certainly, this is something that Horace adopts and uses, I think, quite effectively to generate interest in the city and definitely generate interest in Transylvania. And he's quite successful in bringing students here. Their enrollment, just burgeons and just really takes off. So much so that it's its rivals with Harvard and Yale, and does is higher than Brown and Columbia and some other institutions. And he publishes this frequently. He wants everyone to know that Transylvania is the Athens of the West, and its enrollment sort of proves this point.
Yeah, a gathering place for great minds, great thinkers.
I think so. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that's the genesis of that. Really, is that it is a repository for and a dispensary of knowledge. And I think you see this in, for instance, the collection of medical theses. And this is Horace's idea, and it's Charles Caldwell's idea, who's their dean of their medical school at the time. And this is an idea to have students generate medical theses as their culminating project. So they'll have examinations at the end, but in order to graduate, they have to write a medical thesis. And they'll do so on local topics. But just having that knowledge bound and inserted in the collections of Transylvania University as a repository of knowledge is important. Also certifying, going back and giving, degrees to surgeons and physicians in the area who had never been to school, but therefore, certifying them. It's a way of sort of, legitimizing them and legitimizing the institution in and of itself. So again, the Athens of the West, that sort of idea of you were dispensing information out. And you're the legitimizing factor in the creation of knowledge.
Was Transylvania primarily a medical school at this time, or were there other things that were?
It really does. I mean, that's where most of their enrollment is. And of course, you didn't need to go to, the academical department is what we would associate with as the undergraduate wing of it. And there was a law school that was somewhat successful, although that really struggled for want of professors. They, tried. I think they, several attorneys. I mean, they went after Henry Clay many times, and he put them off, and they just couldn't pay enough. But the academical department was, a feeder institution, if you will, for the medical department, medical school. But again, you didn't need any special credentials. You had to pass an entrance exam. You had to know some Latin and some Greek and some other languages, and your math and some geography. But otherwise, you were free to enter.
How long was his tenure?
Horace was here from 1818 to 1827.
Yeah,
really short time.
And on this trip to Europe, you said he took this traveling. What did you call it?
Well, traveling academy. He tried. Yeah. That was the plan. That was the intention. But and that was going to be sort of fed by students of the great plantations of the South, and so these great French-speaking families who sent their sons up to study at Transylvania. Because remember, Transylvania is the only institution really in the West of any note. And so all over the West, and Jefferson comments on this, and Jefferson's afraid at some point that if we don't build up, and he's making a case for his own university, Jefferson is, if we don't build up our own institution, we're going to send all our sons out to Kentucky, which wouldn't be a bad thing, he says, because it has more of the flavor of the old cask than anything else, which is great. Jefferson loved Kentucky so much. But everyone's sending their sons to Lexington, and this was true for these French plantation owners. And so Horace is, enlivened by this and says, goodbye, Transylvania, and goes down to try to coordinate things, and puts together hundreds and hundreds of letters of introduction to French and British and Spanish courts, and is all ready to go. And the plans just fall apart when he gets into New Orleans, and the family say, wow, we really can't fund that. That's pretty expensive. We didn't really think this would work. And then they go after him to be the president of the University of New Orleans, which he's ready to do. He's gearing up to do, and then he gets sick with yellow fever and passes.
Oh, so it was yellow fever that took him.
Yellow fever, and he mistakes it for just a healthy acclimation to the Louisiana heat. And it should be mentioned that he gets on the ship with yellow fever, and when the ship finally docks in Boston, they unload 3 other victims.
Oh,
so.
Yeah. He helped spread it.
He did. He did.
Probably not the best thing to be known for.
Well, especially for someone who was president of what essentially was a medical company.
Well, that's a great point. The irony in that.
Yeah. Well,
though that medicine was certainly not his specialty.
No,
they didn't quite understand everything back then either.
Well, and that's what I'm not a scientist by training. I'm a historian by training, but I love science and medicine of this period because it's no, you're putting the leech in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it is really. I'm oversimplifying it, but
this period you're actually starting to get some of that real.
Well, yeah, but you know, it's
there's still a lot that's not.
And that was I think that one of the most interesting things, because in order to understand Horace and his accomplishments at Transylvania, you really need to understand the medical school. And the medical school built itself on this reputation of being medicine from Kentucky for Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And this plays into the idea of the New World treatments are more authentic and therefore better than the Old World treatments of Europe. You can only cure certain diseases in Bell County with knowledge of the topography of Bell County or Clark County. So, so many of these early medical theses are things like studies of average, amounts of rainfall, how rivers and streams and wind patterns, and really interesting.
That is fascinating. How important was the university to the city? I mean, I imagine that it was
of integral importance. That's a great question. And visitors, I think, uniformly to Lexington immediately comment on Transylvania University. And this is at a time when I think most other towns in the area, Cincinnati, Louisville, Chillicothe, some of these other great and burgeoning, urban centers are trying to build up their own reputation, and so they're, looking for things to copy. And they see Transylvania, and they see the building. The main building was the largest that most people had ever seen in the West, and that's and the city itself was sort of falling apart, according to a lot of people, travel accounts. But Transylvania really just kind of stood out as this center of great learning, and I think Horace had a lot to do with associating himself with the buildings and just the esteem of the college.
This is well before the automobile, certainly a horse and buggy, main transportation, still a lot of fields around. And not really a lot of photographs, obviously, from this period, but certainly representations of how it looked.
And there's a great travel account by John James, who's a student in Cincinnati, and he's on his way down to Lexington to visit a friend who's at Transylvania. And he writes extensively about Horace, but on his way in, he takes the toll road from Georgetown, and he talks about it. It's ground smooth, and the great plantations that he's passing, and that gives way to this kind of urban decay, roughly hewn rocks in the streets, and the sidewalks are almost impassable. The courthouse doesn't even have a clock in it, and, but the university stands out. Among a forest of grove, and it's beautiful. And
it's like an Eden.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, right.
We're talking with James P. Cousin. He's written a book about Horace Holley. University Press of Kentucky publishes, and Mac McCormick is here with us. And Mac, is something else you'd like to ask James about the book, like something else you find interesting?
I was curious in general about what university education was like in that era, and how did Transylvania, say, compare to the East Coast schools, and then how did the American education system, say, compare to the British at the time?
Right. Oh, that's a great question, and it doesn't warrant a short answer.
But it's not a nutshell. But I mean, talk about it briefly, and because there are big differences then and now, and coast to coast, and
there are, and of course, many parents didn't really rely on an institution to provide the rudiments of education. That is, your basic grammar and your reading and your writing. Most of that was done privately in the home. The idea of an institution, certainly in this period, is more about finishing and more about acquiring the skills and abilities of a useful gentleman to society as much as anything else. So learning Latin, not because it would help you learn other subjects, because because it would help you sort of transfer to other fields, but because it was the language of gentlemen. It was, and it helped you in court and helped you make connections, and also reflected well on families, I think, to send their sons to university, regardless of what the actual content was of that, because you had that discretionary income that you could dedicate, a son of good, healthy, working age, and to spend years of their life. That spoke well of your family. I wanted to tell this story through Horace Holley because Horace grows up in this environment. His father is a wealthy merchant in Connecticut, and his father's decision to send not only him but both of his brothers, and then he has 5 brothers, sends them all to university, for the simple reason of he feels like his time, his family's time has come, and this is what all good, respectable American families should do. Really, he grows more and more. Horace's father does, disenchanted with the idea of university when Horace wants to continue on, and Horace has this outlandish idea of graduating, and no one really graduates at that time. And his father says, okay, and he kind of cedes that, and then he says, but you have to study law, and so you go apprentice. And so he tries that for a couple months, and that really doesn't catch Horace's fancy, and so he writes his father and says, well, I want to go back and study theology. And he says, what, more school? I don't want to graduate, and I want to become so. Mm-hmm. But so that kind of transferability, and I would argue that exists today. I mean, people really still don't understand what university is really supposed to do.
And I certainly had several friends who were on the 8 or 9 year degree program.
And Horace, you look at one right here.
Horace is right there.
There's no doubt, and I don't think that's anything that has changed.
7 or 8 degrees too.
Yeah.
But the question about how Transylvania's curriculum differed from, say, European models or Eastern models is a really good one. It's and in many ways, it's meant to mirror the curriculum of the East Coast, which is sort of an artificial interpretation of Oxford and Cambridge in and of itself. So the basics are there. How it's taught, the rudiments of that in the kind of space, difficult to say. But it's there's certainly that kind of great aspirational quality that's really kind of attracted me to Horace and attracted me to Kentucky history in general. Is that idea that education can be this great social kind of tool of mobility, and that you can use it to push your family forward for generations. Mm-hmm.
And do you get an idea of what a day was like for a president of the university at the time, like for Horace?
Yeah, that's funny. That's in the book because I don't remember. But Horace writes, sort of in exasperation of his schedule. And I think he's writing his sister at the time. And he says, he gets up and he attends lectures. He's teaching.
Yeah, I was going to say, does he teach?
Sure, he teaches moral philosophy, which is, so he's, as president, and most university presidents at the time have the same sort of responsibilities. He's in charge of the senior class. Mm-hmm. So the senior class reports to him, and they are there to complete their education, prepare for their final exams. Beyond that, he, duties in Frankfurt, took him,
when you say duties, would they be like
fundraising? Politicking,
mm-hmm.
for more money.
Okay.
Which Transylvania was...
Which is just like we do nowadays.
Right.
Got to meet with the governor, lobbyists. Even back then.
Yeah.
And did so, quite effectively for a number of years, of course, until, you get the change from Adair to Governor Desha, and that kind of wave of populism hits Kentucky and Lexington and carries higher education out with it.
In other words, there's a lot of things that still resonate.
There are, and the public still doesn't really grasp what higher education is and why we need to fund it. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, I think higher education could do a better job in informing the public and the utility of it. Mm-hmm. The calls for vocationally focused degrees over something in English or the humanities or social sciences kind of is a reflection of that. I think just a misunderstanding of what the university is and what it's for.
Who was Constantine Samuel Rafinesque?
Rafinesque was, he's a figure.
He's a character.
Yeah, he figures largely in Transylvania's history. He was a naturalist at a time when you don't really have many naturalists. So, and Horace and Constantine's relationship is always strained. And, of course, there's this great story of Rafinesque finally being fired by Horace and, casting a curse on the university, and then Horace dies shortly
Oh,
thereafter.
wow.
So
well, it's the curse of Rafinesque is why they say old Morrison burns down every other generation.
Oh.
so,
What did he teach?
so botany
Okay.
and zoology. And neither of which Horace really understood. And therein lies the friction, because Constantine was here for free. All he asked was for a room, not even board. He asked for board early on and then just said, well, forget it. Just give me a room, somewhere to store my specimens. And part of that meant that he was, storing specimens. And so Horace would walk by and see, a bunch of weeds stacked high in a room and were upset, and then he'd say, where's Constantine? And Constantine was out for weeks, sometimes months at a time, going out and trying to identify and find species and bring them back. And so what really precipitates this argument is one day Horace just gathers up his collections and just throws them out.
Oh no!
Yeah, right. So but he respected Rafinesque's ability to self-promote. And this is something that was really near and dear to Horace. Again, it was about promoting higher education, specifically in Kentucky and then really specifically in Lexington. And Rafinesque was this new breed of scholar who would sign his name to his work and publish regularly, hundreds of articles, just on identifying things in the local, the Western Review, but also in Eastern journals. And so that did a lot to up the prestige of the university. And Horace did like that.
I was just about to say if that elevated the prestige a little bit, having someone like that.
Yeah, and it's the only thing that keeps Constantine, I think, around for so long. Otherwise, he would have been gone, almost immediately.
He was not the most pleasant person, from what I gathered.
He liked the natural world more than he liked
humanity. He wasn't a people person.
Well, there's a lot of those.
There's
a lot of those in universities.
And naturalist is a pretty good career
to
choice for someone who doesn't like people. So
that's very interesting. Yeah. So would you say Horace's tenure at the university, how significant was
important, but for different reasons, and that's really why I wanted to write the book. It's important because it is a high watermark for, I think, Kentucky history and Kentucky intellectualism, and it's proof that Kentucky does have a strong intellectual tradition that stretches back well into the 19th century, and that's important because I think we've done so much in this state to denigrate education in order to make a point, and in that you lose the narrative. And this great sort of history of, academics in the state is important. It's important for that reason that Horace has his own sort of dedicated look. And some people have tried this recently, but they've just been sort of reduplicating things that have been out there. And this is an attempt to just bring a fresh perspective, bring evidence that no one's used before and accumulate it and just let him tell the story. But also it's important in the creation of the university. This is another kind of hole in academic literature. What the university is becoming, what it's meant to do in this early nation period, the early republic, historians call it. It's an important period in Americans developing a sort of a national concept of themselves, and universities figure right in that. And so it's an important tale that way, and in the professionalization of academia, Horace considers himself an academic first, and a minister a distant second over time. And he looks to recruit people of that kind of ilk. Rafinesque, for instance, right? Didn't recruit Rafinesque, but he certainly played into that.
He inherited him.
But, bringing in scientists that were not theologians, bringing in historians and people that specialized in law and other fields, that identified with those sort of professions first and foremost. That's an important story because it lays the foundation for things that historians don't believe happens for another 100 years in the progressive era, the origins of professionalism and that professional identity. I argue you can push all the way back to the 1810s and 20s. Yeah, I try to do a lot in the book. This is a biography, so it is sort of a life and times, and I think that's important. But it's also telling these broader stories. I talk a lot, for instance, about the old court, new court schism, and currency depreciation in the state, and again, this rise of populism, how education plays in nationalism, the idea of what education is, and you get this kind of shot through Horace's life, and it's evolving in his own life and evolving nationally. What it means to the family, what it means to him personally, what it means to ambition, and people are trying to create these new careers, and they have that potential here in America, and how education figures into that. These are all embedded, and you get I think a better sense for this when you tell it through a biography rather than an institutional history.
Curtains at 8 on 91.3 WUKY. Joe Conkright in for Nick Lawrence, visiting with James P. Couzens. He's the author of a book about former Transylvania University President Horace Holley, Transylvania University and the Making of Liberal Education in the Early American Republic. Mac McCormick of University Press of Kentucky joins us as well. And Mac, you had a question for James?
Well, you had mentioned the they when you were talking about, getting a house, which brings up the other side of the equation. I found his relationship with his wife fascinating, and her to be just a fascinating character, and an important character in a lot of ways in and of herself.
Right. Yeah. Mary obviously warrants her own biography, and she has one. Rebecca Smith Lee publishes a biography of her, and that's been some time, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s. Her biography of Mary Austin Holley. Mary Austin Holley from the Austins of Texas, obviously. But Unitarians, in their nature, they're very supportive, very egalitarian, and women figure largely in their circles of intellectual elites, and you can see that in the writing, and his attitude towards Mary is that of an equal, a partner in most decisions. Respects her immensely, and she's very bright, and he does as much as he can to sort of foster an intellectual discourse with her throughout their lives, and they feed on that. They translate poetry from French and German. They engage in high political discourse and gossip, obviously, and she's his confidant, but also someone that sort of holds him in check and pushes him forward in all these ways. She goes on after Horace's passing. She returns to New Orleans for a brief time to be the nanny of a wealthy family, but then follows Stephen, her cousin Stephen, out to Texas. Stephen F. Austin, the great impresario of Texas, trying to colonize Texas. She follows him out there and does as much, and she had that great sort of optimism also. And Texas is now this great, emporium of the West, and and she writes the first history of Texas in an effort to, get subscriptions and get people out there to settle Texas. They were quite a team, really.
Did they have children?
They had two children. Harriet, whose house, so she marries William Brand, who is the son of a local attorney, who then himself becomes a well-known attorney, and that house is still on 3rd Street. You can find that. Yeah. And then his son Horace Holley Jr. Passes without any children of his own. So.
Did he stay in the state, or did he move?
He moves with his mother. There was some attempt to have him educated at West Point, and for that they needed a letter from Henry Clay, and Henry Clay writes back and says, "I'm sorry, madam, I can't accommodate your request."
Wow.
He was a young boy at the time, and Henry didn't think it was appropriate to have someone so young at the institution.
Yeah.
Which,
but might have been the legit reason.
Yeah,
might have been
sure.
not,
Yeah. Or he might have just been all.
It was politics.
Still, yeah, maybe.
It was politics. Well, I've certainly enjoyed talking to you, and this book is available now.
It is on the shelves now.
Just in time for Christmas.
Just in time for Christmas. And
speaking of books for Christmas and everything, this will interest anybody that has an interest in certainly local history, Kentucky history, history of education itself.
Sure. Right.
Which, if anybody is knows someone who is studying to be a teacher or anything like that, or has any interest in what it means. To have a liberal education, or exactly what that means.
Yeah.
So this will be a good gift for someone like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You too.
James, very nice to meet you,
Nice
and
to
thanks
meet
for
you.
coming back to Kentucky. Enjoy your time here, and certainly safe travels all the way back to Michigan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And Mac, always good to see you. Come in
Pleasure
again.
as always.
I'm Joe Conkright for Nick Lawrence. Thank you for joining us on Curtains at 8. And from all of us here at WUKY, thanks for listening and good night.